we left off with the agnathans, the jawless fishes, which we talked about hagfish and lampreys. And I believe we made it to the cartilaginous fish. And if you find your handout, like I have up on the screen, then we can take it from there. The cartilaginous fish, there's not just a ton of stuff to talk about. They start on page 525. Yeah, we'll pick those up. And the flow chart's awful small here because there's not a whole lot to say. These fish, 850 living species. They are made of cartilage, interior, no bone. And examples are sharks, skates, and rays. So the cartilaginous fish. It's really starting on page 526. The sharks, skates, and rays, they simply talk about the uniqueness of having the cartilaginous component to them. And then as far as form and function, if we're looking at a shark, to the average person, their sinister appearance seems like death coming at them, right? Fearsome. We think shark, we think somebody's going to get their leg bit off. We think Jaws, the movie Jaws. Not all sharks are that bad. Granted, the great white shark and some tiger sharks have been known to kill people, kill a person or two, kill a few. Some unique components of these animals are what they refer to as the heterocircle tail, which is top of 527. It gives them a lot of whip. Instead of their spine just ending straight, it turns and goes up in the upper portion of that tail, which really gives them a lot of strength in the upper portion of the tail fin. And they have pectoral, pelvic fins, they have dorsal fins, caudal fins, anal fins. And one unique thing they have is called placoid scales. Now, placoid scales covers the exterior of the body. They are replaced from time to time. I'm going to turn these lights back on. When they shed one, they replace it. But their teeth are also made of placoid scales. So if a shark gets a hold of something that's a little tougher than his teeth, and he pulls some teeth out trying to tear whatever it is up, no big deal, he'll grow them back. And like ourselves, we lose a tooth, we're gumming things and eating soup the rest of our life, right? So placoid scales is a unique component of these animals. Now sharks obviously have a lateral line like most fish do, so that gives them that distance touch like we talked about with other fish, why we were supposed to be quiet when we're little fishing, and even now because of the lateral line. Now if we look at sharks' reproduction over on 528, you'll find that a shark fits every category: oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. They fit every category. The sand sharks that we may get to dissect in a couple of weeks in lab, who knows, we may double up next week and do them all. Those sand sharks fit ovoviviparous, and they have internal fertilization. They have no placenta. They do have uterine development, but they develop from an egg yolk. And typically we'll have at least one that's pregnant. We'll get to cut the babies out of it, and the egg yolks will still be attached. But there won't be attachment to the internal part of the uterus by placenta by any means. So those fit the ovoviviparous category. There are some sharks that have a placental attachment, and that would be viviparous. And then there's some sharks that fit oviparous. And the sharks that fit oviparous throw all their genetic material into a pouch they call a mermaid's purse. And the mermaid's purse has tentacles. And so when they throw them in this pouch, throw everything in this pouch, kind of like the cocoon of an earthworm or a leech. So you just throw them in there and dump the pouch. The pouch goes to sinking through the water and has all these little tentacles on it. And when it comes in contact with something, it just latches on. And it may hang there for quite some time, 6 to 9 months before they hatch. Actually is how long they say. Now, mom and dad may not be alive in 6 to 9 months. If they are, they may not be anywhere around there. So when these babies hatch, they're on their own, as with a lot of them. So there's a shark for every little niche. Now, one other unique thing about sharks that I want to mention here before we move on to bony fish And this is talked about a little bit later in this chapter, but you remember back when we talked about different types of solutions, and we had hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic solutions? We do remember that? Oh, that's good. A shark is living in the ocean. So what type of solution is a shark living in? We remember? No, it's not going to be ISO. ISO's even both in and out.
It's hyper.
Hyper. I knew we'd eventually get it. We only had 3 shots. It is hypertonic, because hypertonic, there's more solute outside than inside. Okay? So a shark living in this kind of environment does not like to deal with it like the normal bony fish in that environment does. So what a shark does is actually maintain or hold on and keep in the bloodstream larger amounts of urea, which is protein from food sources that it eats. So he has larger amounts of urea, which equals creates a hypertonicity inside that equals the tonicity outside. And so there is no influx or outflux of water. When we were in a hypotonic solution, what happened to us? When we were swimming in a freshwater stream or lake, the cells swelled, we gained water. And when old Fred jumped overboard out in the salty ocean, he shrank, didn't he? So the shark's not doing either, because he reached a tonicity inside using urea to match the salty tonicity outside, and he's not doing either. Now the disadvantage to this is his buoyancy is less, so he doesn't float as well. In fact, if he stops swimming, he'll start gradually sinking. Sharks typically, if they're not swimming, they're at rest on a ledge, they beach themselves, shallower water, something like that. Otherwise, they're moving. They have to keep moving or they keep sinking, okay? Now, that would be a shark in a hypertonic type of solution. If we look at regular marine bony fish in this same hypertonic solution, here's the issues they deal with. The average fish in this would be like average Joe in this. They're going to shrivel up and actually become dehydrated living in a watery environment. It almost sounds goofy as all heck, but it's true. But the only option they have is to drink the salt water. That's what we'd be told not to do, right? Because it'd make you thirstier. Well, that's what they do. So as they begin to dehydrate, swimming in this ocean water, high salty environment, they get thirsty, so they drink the salt water. But they have special salt-secreting glands that excrete the excess salt back out into the ocean. So they're good, right? Until they start shriveling again. When they start becoming dehydrated again, they drink the water, salt-secreting glands secrete it back out into the ocean, and they're good for a while. And until they start becoming dehydrated again, and then they drink the water, and then they excrete the excess salt out, and then we're good for a while. So it's a constant conformation. They're trying to conform to their environment. Now, we take a freshwater fish, or I think the book used an example of what's called a brackish water shore crab. That's a mouthful, so I like to use that example. What is brackish water? Mixture of salt and fresh. Exactly right. And so even at brackish water level, it still would be considered a hypotonic type solution. So the average bony fish swimming around in our lakes and streams would be like this brackish water shore crab. They're going to intake water. So they intake water, it's no big deal. They have kidneys, so they excrete it as urine. What's the problem with this? They typically lose too much salt out of their system. So they have specialized glands that actually grab salt out in fresh water, bring it back in to their system, and when they do so, then they start gaining water again, and then they pee out the excess water with too much salt. So they have to get some more salt. Again, they're conforming to their environment, they're going through the same routine all the time, and they do it well. To me, it'd just be a pain to have to do it all the time, but they do. They have to do it. Then we'll get in the latter part of this chapter, like salmon, who are hatched in freshwater streams and swim out to salt water. Their whole system has to change to go from freshwater to salt water, and then at some point in their life, they turn around and come back to salt water, and they die. Why? because their system can't change back. It makes one major change so they can go to salt water, but it cannot change back so they go back to fresh water. And so what eventually kills them is accumulation of poisons because their kidney don't excrete like it used to. Okay, so we'll get to that when we hit that. So, next topic would be the bony fish, class Osteichthyes, also known as class Actinopterygii. If you look at your your flow chart, this is what you're going to see. 23,600 species. This class is second to insects in numbers. Now, fishes are second to arthropods in numbers. So we're dealing with huge masses of numbers. This is 23,600 species. On the insects, if I'm not mistaken, whiz over 1 million something on insects. So we're not even close, yet we're number 2 here with fishes. Now, first we'll look at this one on this side, the lobefin. We touched, I don't think I actually did in this class. The lobefin fish is a very relic group. I think there's only one species left, but this is where you're gonna find them. This is on your study guide. They asked where are these found? Australia, Africa, and South America. And this fish has learned to adapt in its extremely harsh environment. You have rainy seasons and extremely dry seasons. I'm beginning to think all we have is dry seasons around here. Rainy seasons, they're fine. They're out swimming around in their pools of water, and they reproduce, they do whatever these little lobefin fishes do. But when it comes to dry season and the pools of water are drying up to nothing, they're either gonna die or they have to find some kind of adaptation to survive until the next rainy season. They did. What they do is bury themselves down into the mud at the bottom of this pool of water as deep as they can go. And they create a slime that covers the interior of this pocket that they're living in, and it keeps that pocket moist. As long as their skin is moist, they can diffuse oxygen. So that's why they call them lobefin, is because it's not, well, actually there's lungfish is the other term, because they have to do some kind of breathing besides gills. Now, do they have lungs? I really don't think so, but they have to use something besides gills. And so they sit here in this little slimy pocket with moist skin until the next rainy season. When the next rainy season comes, it starts raining a lot, well, moisture oozes down into the pocket that they're at, and they realize there's lots of water up there, and so they break out of the pocket and go up to the water and start their process all over again. So there's only, like I said, one relic group here called the lobefin fish, also known as lungfish, but found in Australia, Africa, and South America. So that's a unique one. Everything else is going to fit over here in the ray fin fishes. Again, class Actinopterygii. An old terminology which I think fits it better is Osteichthyes, osteo in reference to bony fish. These are all the fish of today that we're familiar with. We're going to look at a couple different categories. The first one is the more primitive chondrostines. You'll need to know examples of this. The primitive chondrostines occur, which are in African waters, which you probably never laid eyes on. If you were to Google that, it would look somewhat like an eel. And these are pretty neat pictures to look at. Some of us, although we have paddlefish and sturgeon here in the United States, some of us never laid eyes on one. And those would be also neat to Google and look up. But there's your examples of the primitive chondrostines. And the paddlefish is still quite a game fish of today. I mean, we have them, paddlefish coming up Arkansas River. People go down to Curlockin' Down and catch paddlefish. But the biggest place in Oklahoma is Grand Lake. And Grand Lake's huge for paddlefish. And the eggs of paddlefish create the number 2. What do you create with eggs? Caviar. Eggs of paddlefish is the number 2 caviar of the world. Now, there's an industry that somebody figured out. And they were really good at pretty much catching more paddlefish than they need to, so they could get the eggs. And they had a black market where they knew somebody that could make caviar out of the eggs, and so they'd sell their eggs to this guy, and this guy would make the caviar and then ship it all over the world. And make tons of money. Well, the Oklahoma Game and Fish, when it come the time of the year that paddlefish spawn, like every manpower that they had went to Grand Lake. We're gonna slow this process down. We're gonna put a stop to it. Even to the point they finally caught the guy that was making the caviar. He was from Kansas. They caught him and gave him an option. The option was, you can either go to jail for a long time, pay lots of fines, possibly give up all your equipment, hunting rights, whatever. There's even working with the state of Kansas on this, I'm pretty sure. But, or you can make caviar for the state of Oklahoma. Guess what he's doing today? Making caviar for the state of Oklahoma. So what the state does, you got a limit on how many of these paddlefish you can catch. And when somebody catches one in Grand Lake, they have stations that they have to report to. They can report to any of many stations available, which game and fish employees are working these stations. And if it's a male, they'll clean the male, they'll cut up the meat however you want it, bag it, they tagged it, it's yours to keep. If it's female, they'll do the same thing, except we keep the eggs. Not a bad deal if you think about it. Of course, we bag the eggs, and we ice down the eggs, and we send them to the guy that makes caviar, and we ship it all over the world, and U.S. Game and Fish, I say U.S., Oklahoma Game and Fish has another income. Wasn't a bad idea. To me, it's almost borderline illegal, but they created it legal. They made it legal since we're doing it, right? But I thought it was a pretty cool story. I'd heard that story from two different game and fish people. But you know how state pay is. If you work for a state or nobody knows somebody that works for a state, a game warden might get paid $30,000 a year. For what? To get shot at and threatened and cussed and everything else? So, I mean, it's a life of survival. So why not find another income? And maybe give them a raise because of it. So that is pretty neat. Sturgeon, I believe the Colorado River, you'll find some sturgeon in. I'm not sure where else you'll find sturgeon. The other category we're going to look at here in ray fin fish is neuropterygens. Neuropterygens come in two categories, non-teloist and teloist. The non-teloist, your examples are gar and bowfin. And the reason they fit this category is they really don't have any major form of swim bladder. They have to come to the surface of the water to gulp air into the swim bladder so they can't adjust it any at all. Now, you see gar surfacing a lot, and that's why they're surfacing. They're not up there trying to find scum on top of the water like if it's in Worcester Lake, they'd find scum and air with it. But bowfin are the same way, and we have bowfin right here at Poto River. There's been bowfin cut out of Poto River, but they'll tell you in the book bowfin's more common in the weedy waters of the Great Lakes. But that's a pretty cool looking fish. Both of those have to do that. And there's actually a handful of trout that in fact, there's quite a few trout that have to come to the surface to gulp. But then there are some trout, like lake trout, that live quite deep in major lakes, and they have a swim bladder that they adjust according to the gas content down in the water, that they use a capillary system to adjust. We'll talk about that in a minute. So in the teloist, it's basically all of our familiar scaled fish, with one exception. We'll throw a catfish in there too. There's your exception. So hopefully this flow chart will separate these out for you. Starting at the top with ray fin, primitive chondrostines, then we have teloist and non-teloist, and you need to know examples of each one of those, okay? All right, any questions there? They have it in the reading on 531, same thing I put on the flow chart. I've tried just the reading before, but to me the flow chart looks easier, so I started doing that several years ago, and it seems to, I get a little better results on the test, I'll put it that way. The lobe fin fish are talked about on 533, and then on 534 we just get into locomotion in water. Locomotion in water. And I think some unique things about fish. Anybody, you like to eat fish? I mean, I like to eat fish. You don't like to eat fish? When did you try it last?
Before my dad burnt my house down at the end of the day.
that would give me a bad taste in my mouth about fish, wouldn't it? All I remember about fish is, it burnt my house down. That's sad, isn't it? Well, I guess that's maybe the reason the wife makes me cook outside. Just hot grease everywhere, cook outside. Okay. Look at this picture on 535. Notice the way that the muscle is layered, almost in accordion style. And it's layered this way so we get a width of the tail. The longer the fish, the stronger the fish. Would you agree with that? Now, a crappie puts up a nice little battle, and we know they're tasty when we get them in the boat. But a bass will battle you even more. It's longer. Okay? Anybody ever caught muskie or pike gone up north? Caught anything like that? Yeah, me neither, but I dream of it one day. But these fish, and I've watched enough Bill Dance shows, I know these fish battle. But if you think about it, they're long, they're pretty big around, but they really have a lot of length to them. And they really put on a battle. So, you ever caught a gar? And usually accidentally, I don't typically go out and just try to catch gar, but I have before. But they really put on a pretty good battle, but it's because of that whip. It's exactly what it is. And if you ever eaten like a whole fish, you ever had one laid on your plate with just its head cut off and everything else is still there? Yeah, and you start flaking these muscles off, they flake off in these layers, just like you see in this picture. And that gives them the whip. Now, there's a study guide question on there to ask, what's the propulsive mechanism of a fish? Anybody got your study guide out, rocking and rolling? We cover quite a few study guide questions as we go through this, believe it or not. I'm not sure what number that is, propulsive mechanism of a fish. Find it? It is the head and trunk musculature. Tail and trunk musculature is what it is. Tail and trunk musculature. And the head and the tail go opposite directions. They call it a yaw. Tail and trunk musculature. On the right-hand side of 535, it talks about the thrust, which is used to overcome drag and propels the fish forward, and the lateral force, which tends to make the fish's head yaw, or move in the opposite direction of the tail. So, if the tail and the head went in the same direction, if you think about this, they'd just circle themselves. They never would get anywhere with it. Sidewinder snake, probably, or you never know. Well, those muscles, where they're layered, that's called myomeres, and they have that on that page as well. Looking on 536, they say swimming is the most economical form of animal locomotion, largely because aquatic animals are almost perfectly supported by their medium and need to expend little energy to overcome the force of gravity. You know, if you go try to pick up something heavy, it's a lot easier to pick it up if it's already submerged in water, isn't it? Kind of takes gravity out of the picture. There's a couple of things I want to pinpoint back here on 534. I kind of overlooked those. They do a couple of, like a general rule, and they give us an idea of how fast these fish are. Now, to the naked eye, to a human, to see a fish swim off, say, that fish is fast. But compared to us swimming, which the direction I swim usually is down, sink. So we don't do well that way. But they tell you the speeds, if you break them down in the miles per hour, a 1 foot long trout can swim about 6.5 miles per hour. That's not really much. But compared to what we can swim, that's a lot. At least they're still alive at the end of 6.5 miles. I'd have been dead before I ever got started. So, now here's a general rule. I like general rules. Sometimes I add to them. As a general rule, the larger the fish, the faster it can swim. Would you agree that's true? Yes? It is true. I mean, it says it word for word there in the book, so it's a true statement. But if I add to this, I'm trying to trick you, see, I'm preparing you ahead. As a general rule, the larger the fish, the faster it can swim, and the more it will eat. Will that be a true statement? You think so? You like to fish?
Yeah, we'll do that.
When you fish for when you go, you think you're gonna go catch a big fish, do you use the smallest bait in your tackle box? Let's throw a big bait at them, right? Now, big fish may not eat as often, but they don't have to, because when they eat something big. But, so it is a true statement. As a general rule, the larger the fish, the faster it can swim, and the more it will eat. And they'll even tell you in here as we get over here that a fish expends massive amounts of energy throughout its life, even on a daily basis, finding food. Food is important. I mean, if there's plenty of food, you typically don't catch a skinny fish, do you? Now, I told the other class yesterday, if I was a fish, I'd already been caught and fried, because I like to eat. I said, that looks good, I think I'll just latch on to that. Well, that one over there looks pretty good too. I wouldn't be one of the lucky ones. I guess the finicky fish are the ones that's still alive out there. All right, looking at neutral buoyancy over on 536. This is dealing with a swim bladder. Most of our fish that we're familiar with in the Teleost are scaled fish. They have some kind of swim bladder. A lot of oceanic bony fish, most of them is going to have some kind of swim bladder. In fact, I'd say the majority will have some kind of swim bladder. What's the purpose of a swim bladder? Equalize pressure. If they're below sea level, there's going to be a pressure upon their body that they have to equalize inside to keep that pressure from squeezing them to death. And the purpose of the swim bladder is to equalize that pressure. Now, they have tremendous ability to do this. Now, granted, most of our lakes and streams around here is not going to be just extremely deep where it will just crush one. But if they don't have a swim bladder, they're not going to be able to live very deep. Okay? So, they talk about a couple of different sets of capillaries. And what happens when a fish is going through its respiratory process with its set of gills, it'll bring in water through its mouth and pass it out its gills, and then bring it back through its gills, back out its mouth. That's how it moves water past its gills. And then the gills, the blood flow, the gills are just little capillaries. The blood flow is in an opposing direction of the water flow, which that conflict is the extraction aspect of getting the oxygen out of the water. We breathe atmospheric oxygen, which is about 20.9%. We use about 1% of our body energy to breathe. If we required much more than that, it'd be tough to survive, wouldn't it? A fish uses 20% of its body energy just to breathe, because they only have 0.9% saturated oxygen in the average water. The cooler the water, the more saturated oxygen. The warmer the water, the less saturated oxygen. So in the hot summertime, you're not going to see one up sunning on the bank. Or in shallow water where sun's hitting it directly, there's no oxygen in that water. You ever been swimming and the upper part of your body's in hot water and your feet are dangling in cold water? You ever been in that situation? There are thermoclines is what it's called, levels, and there's different ones. The cold thermoclines is the level at which you will find most of your fish, because that's where your oxygen levels are. Without oxygen, you can forget it. The fish become extremely lethargic. Worcester Lake is not a very deep lake. It amazes me that fish even live in it. If you find a channel somewhere, you might get 30-something feet this time of year, and it's pretty low right now. If you're lucky, you might, and that's up close to the dam where it's going out. The rest of the lake, it wouldn't be uncommon to be scooting out across there and hit a foot of water and just land your boat right there. I mean, it's not uncommon. I know when it gets low in the heat of the summer, fish in that lake actually get rather lethargic, and that's because of lack of oxygen. Lack of oxygen. All right, so we have, once we countercurrent this flow, and it's called a countercurrent system, is how they breathe. Once we countercurrent the flow and we bring in gases, mostly oxygen, but there's argons and maybe some carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide brought in. It says this gas diffused into the blood at the ovale. That's the first set of capillaries. This is a vascularized area of the swim bladder. Both types of fishes require gas to be secreted into the swim bladder from the blood. Although a few shallow water inhabiting phytostomes, this is a type of fish, may gulp air to fill their swim bladder. And we already said that your non-telois garden both ends do that. Then we have a gas gland, which secretes lactic acid, which enters the blood, causing a localized high acidity in the reap marble. This is your second set of capillaries. That forces hemoglobin to release its load of oxygen. Where's it going? To the swim bladder. Okay? So what's not going to the swim bladder is going to the muscle tissue. So this second set of capillaries serves two purposes: managing the swim bladder, managing oxygen release for the muscles. Now, how good are these swim bladders? Amazing effectiveness of this device is exemplified by a fish living at a depth of 2,400 meters, 8,000 feet. I don't know anybody's got a fishing reel that hold that much line, do you? You'd reel forever just to get one cast in, wouldn't you, if you went all the way to the bottom? To keep the bladder inflated at that depth, the gas inside, mostly oxygen, but variable amounts of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, argon, and even carbon monoxide, must have a pressure exceeding 240 atmospheres, which is greater than the pressure in a fully charged steel gas cylinder. In essence, what they're saying is, if you caught a fish, and it wouldn't even have to be 8,000 feet down. If you caught a fish 1,000 feet down and reeled it up fast enough, it probably wouldn't be on your hook when you got it there. It would explode, literally. And it's not uncommon for these fish, they pull them up fast enough, just a few hundred feet down, when they get them on deck, their eyeballs pop out. Because they don't have time to adjust the internal pressure to equal the external pressure, which is less at this point. See, they're dealing with some serious pressure down there. I guess if you got them at the right depth, they'd clean themselves on the deck right there, wouldn't it? That'd be a good fish to have right there. Hearing. The fish hear. Through the lateral line process, they list Weberian ossicles, which are basically bones in their head. So we already said they had the lateral line. We told the story about banging on the side of the boats and everything else, and they're hearing this. Well, it's vibrating through the water, through the bones, into the bones of the head. Yes, that's the way they hear. Respiration, gills, countercurrent system, just like I explained. Most of our bony fish in the telos category have gill flaps called operculums that cover the gills. The osmotic regulation we just covered briefly when we were talking about the sharks, the hypo and hyperosmotic regulators. And that takes us over to feeding behavior. Fish, they're going to give you a lesson in fishing here. It's really easy to write it down until you're the one they're talking about here, the luckless angler that fishes all day and catches absolutely nothing. I would quit before then. Fishermen are extremely patient people in most cases. Most people that think they like to fish but only like to fish when the fish are biting, those aren't fishermen. Those are catchermen. You know, if it was easy to catch a fish, they wouldn't call it fishing, they'd call it catching. See what I'm saying? And that's basically what they're saying here. They're saying if you're patient enough and you're where the fish is at some point every day, that fish is going to feed you. You just have to be at the right place, at the right time, with the right food, in front of the right fish. Now, how hard is that? It's amazing we catch as many fish as we do, but so there's all kinds of different tactics we can irritate them. Sometimes they attack our bait just in self-defense, especially during spawn. They'll do that during spawn. So most fish are carnivorous. They tell us that. And prey on a myriad of animals, from zooplankton, insect larvae, to large vertebrates. Some deep sea fishes are capable of eating victims nearly twice their own size, an adaptation for life in a world where meals are infrequent. Well, and I think they make a good point there. Some fish are not real picky, and some fish, you know, where do you think barracuda got its name? That's an aggressive carnivore, and they have teeth to match it. So an aggressive carnivore, you know, if we picked one of our more aggressive fish, it'd probably be a bass, a largemouth bass, or some form of a bass. Get into the striped bass, man, when they're feeding, they're just ferocious. So, I'll give you this example. It's been probably 7, 8, maybe even 10 years now since this happened. But on Lake Sardis, somebody's cruising across the lake, saw something floating out there. Which is a common thing in Worcester, it's usually dead fish. But in Lake Sardis, this is a very unusual thing to see a large dead fish floating. So sure enough, what it was a bass that they predicted if they would have had it alive, it would have been close to the state record at the time. Now, why was it dead? The reason it was dead was extremely obvious. It had approximately a 5-pound bass stuck in its throat. Now, this little fish shouldn't have pissed off the big fish. It killed them both, is what it did, because he choked to death, consuming a smaller fish, which 5 pounds is not that small, but he was 12 to 14. It's like, well, you keep smarting off me, I'll just eat you. It didn't work out so well. So now, me, if I'd have found it, I'd have taken it to a taxidermist and I'd have had him make me a replica just like that. I'd have mounted that sucker, consuming one that's 5 pounds. Would you like to seen that? That'd been pretty awesome to see. They wish they'd had that one alive just to see how much he'd weigh. That's a pretty good sized fish. There are a group of fish that could be herbivores. There are some suspension feeders. As we drop down the food chain, the smaller fish are going to eat zooplankton. They're going to eat whatever's floating around, things that we probably can't even see, diatoms or some of those things that they're going to eat. And then as you get bigger, then they eat the smaller fish. And then just like the food chain is kind of common sense. Other fishes include scavengers. That's hagfishes that we talked about. Other detrivores, suckers and minnows, and then parasitic, which parasitic fish was the hagfish. Well, the hagfish was the scavenger fish. The parasitic fish was the lampreys. Okay. So now, as far as the fish that we consume, where would a catfish fit in there? And let's identify this a little bit. Where would a flathead catfish fit in there? It's a carnivore. Flatheads eat live things. They're going to hunt down their prey, and they're pretty good feeders. If you want to catch flathead catfish on a trot line, you typically use live bait. Large perch would work quite well. Okay. What about a channel catfish or a blue catfish? Where are they going to fit in here? What they are. Now, will they eat a minnow? Yes. Will they eat a worm? Yes. Will they eat crap on the bottom of the lake? Yes. Will they eat something, the more it stinks, the more they eat? Yes. And if you are what you eat, they really should stink a lot more than they do. Trot line, hot dogs work great. I've used chicken liver, I've used chicken gizzards, because they stay on the trot line better and make them work at it more, because it's a muscle. They'll eat it. It doesn't matter. So, yeah. And that's one of our favorite foods. If you eat fish, you eat channel catfish, because they farm fresh raise these things. No, they feed them dog food, probably. We don't even want to know what's in that. So, you know, it seems like the better tasting fish to me are the more carnivorous fish, the crappie and the bass. Of course, striped bass and sand bass, you got to know how to clean them, but they still taste pretty good. Moving on to migration. Freshwater eels. This really messed with the scientists for a while. They didn't figure this out because they thought eels were a lot like salmon. Salmon they knew were hatched in fresh water and went to salt water and spent their lives out there, and at some point they come back to the same stream, same place, laid their eggs and died. Well, they thought that was happening with eels, but it wasn't. Eels live their life in fresh water, swim out to salt water, have their young, and then their young swim back to fresh water. It's right the opposite. So they call eels catadromus. They call salmon anadromus. The difference between where they start and where they end. Okay? Now I love what they call little eels in here. Little eels are called elvers. Now you know. I learned something else the other day. You know what a baby buzzard's called? A cram. K-R-A-M, I believe. A cram. I'm learning something all the time. The more you study, the more you learn. I've been at this a while and still learning stuff all the time. Well, let's look at the homing salmon. The homing salmon are anadromous. What really happens in these homing salmon, they're hatched in a freshwater stream, the parents have died. The small fry, that's what they're called, swim out to the ocean, where they may live 3 to 7 years, who knows. And they come back to the exact same stream, nearly to the exact same spot if they can, lay their eggs, and then they die. And here we go again. So I guess, regardless of the species, species come at different times. If they all came at the same time, we'd be just a tick crowded. So different species spawn at different times. But regardless of the species, all of them have to find their way back. Can you imagine going out to a massive ocean where you can't see anything and knowing exactly where you're going to end up? How do they do it? That's my question. Homing salmon's the title of this, how do they know how to go home? Well, if I knew, I'd be glad to tell you. I was hoping one of y'all would know. They don't really know in here. These scientists, they throw all kinds of ideas out there. Maybe they use the magnetic field of the earth. Maybe they use sun by day and stars by night. Well, probably they would mess that up, wouldn't it? Sonar. Maybe they have their own sonar we don't know about. Finally, I think they just give up the idea and said that they just flow with the ocean currents. They could end up twice as far away if they did that, but they go with the ocean currents, and when they get close to their home stream, they recognize it, swim up it, know exactly where to stop, have the produce their eggs. Do what?
Childhood memories.
Childhood memories. Well, one thing they're pretty sure about is once they find their parent stream, they believe as fries when they leave that they build an odor map of incoming streams to their parent stream, and their parent stream has an odor of its own. They build an odor map, so when they get close to the parent stream, they recognize that, they know where to go, and they know how far up it to go because they use their odor map in reverse. That's the theory that sticks with them at this point. But when you're way out in the ocean, how do you get back to your coast? They have no idea how you get back close to that stream. Who knows? But they believe the odor map is built as a fry and used in reverse. Now, what kills them? The kidney, when the fries leave the freshwater stream, the juxtaglomerular apparatus ceases to function. This is a component of the kidney that apparently deals something with salt. And I know in the human kidney it does deal with sodium, so it would make sense. It ceases to function. Now they can deal with the excess salt out here. Otherwise our kidney would kill themselves trying to manage all this salt. So it just ceases to function, and it starts functioning like any other marine bony fish. So 3 to 7 years later, when they find their parent stream and it's time to go lay eggs, that doesn't kick back in and start functioning. So we're not getting rid of all the poisons that we're starting to accumulate in freshwater, which the poisons actually gives them all the different colors that you see. And the poisons is what finally kills them in the end. Toxins in the body. And guess what salmon we get in Oklahoma when we open a can of salmon? Those with toxins in them. If you go to Alaska, guess where your canneries for salmon are built? Along the streams, not out in the ocean. They're catching them on the spawn. When they're building toxins, that's the ones we get. The best ones are the ones caught in the ocean that have no toxins. See, those are actually good for you.
Should you not eat the ones that they catch?
Oh, it hasn't killed anybody yet, but that we put our finger on, put it that way. Let's just say the taste is probably not near the quality of a fresh salmon caught in the ocean. And of course, you catch early spawn, you're gonna have less toxins, but I'm not convinced that they don't get out there and fight the bear over those that's floating around that's pretty much toast. I don't know. Well, they talk about all that on 541 and 542 about the odor maps and all that, and it's all there. Now, reproduction and growth. Reproduction and growth. We have dioecious with external fertilization, and most fish fit that category. There's males and females. There, believe it or not, there are a handful of fish that at some point in life does sex changes. They may start as a male and turn into a female. They may start as a female and turn into a male. It does happen from time to time. So freshwater fishes usually produce non-billion eggs. So when they lay the eggs, they set and they don't float. Those such as yellow perch provide no parental care. Yellow perch just go down a bank and just chunk eggs. They just throw as many eggs out there and they float around, and they get Sam Hill out of there because they're still small enough to be prey, and they don't want to get cornered up next to a bank. So they throw eggs along the bank and get out and hope some survive. Now we should learn something from that. Have a lot of kids and leave them on, hope a couple survive. I'm afraid that's the way society's headed already. We don't need any more of that. So they throw a myriad of eggs among weeds and along the sediment. Freshwater fishes do not provide egg care, such as bullhead catfish. Now, bullhead catfish and darters, they'll fight to the end to save their eggs. But most of our freshwater fish just throw a lot of eggs out there and hope none of them survive. Because any of those small fish, small fry, if you will, are nice food sources for other fish. It says elaborate preliminaries to mating are the rule of freshwater fishes. A female Pacific salmon, for example, performs a ritualized mating dance with her breeding partner after arrival at the spawning bed in a fast-flowing gravel-bottom stream. Then turns on her side and scoops the nest hole with her tail. As the eggs are being laid by the female, they're fertilized by the male. After the female covers the eggs with gravel, both exhausted fish die. What a way to go, huh? We're done. That finishes chapter 24. And you can turn that off now. I think it's running out of time anyway. I hope we got it all on there. We will I'm going to encourage you highly